crimes stem from this deep ingrained psychological belief. We think this is really hard to undo. Furthermore, when people commit crimes, they think they can get away with it because simply no one's watching. Note with the bracelet, we're able to track your location and we're able to tell you that you were there. 2, why it deters before you commit the crime. We think that if they tell you that they can prove these bracelets are large and visible, even though we've told you they're not, we don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. You're gonna think like as a young person or like as just a person in general, I don't want this bracelet for the rest of my life because it has implications, people are gonna see it and people are gonna discriminate me against it. We think that people slash reoffenders that commit crime often do like this cost-benefit analysis, thinking like, oh, it's only 5 years, or I'm going to do this for like a gang or something like that. But with this bracelet, it's a lifelong benefit that affects them for their whole life. We think this has more substantial weighting. 3, why it deters reoffending. Most people commit crimes when they think they can get away with it. Either they go back because like of a crime of passion and they do it, and we don't think that anyone can stop this if they're truly that incentivized. But we think that people who reoffend are probably more careful because A, they have a harsher crime penalty if they go back, and 2, they've probably learned some tricks from prison that like help them in this case. We think that this bracelet will like help people be tracked, and we think it can be used in a court of law. 4, gangs. Look, this actually stops gangs from recruiting because the moment you go to prison, the moment you do a violent crime, the moment you get that bracelet on, gangs know that they can't recruit you because they know you're going to be tracked. This means that the police and government can find important locations or routes that are vital to the gang, and we think the gangs aren't going to want to do this. 4, you're less likely to get misjustice because you're on a database. You can prove that you're actually not there. This is uniquely beneficial because when violent crimes happen and there are often violent offenders nearby, people jump to conclusions and just think they were the ones who did it. We think we get here like a discrete benefit where like people aren't going to be like mischaracterized and people can prove a way out of it. What do we get here? We get less people reoffending, people being de-incentivized from the start, and I've told you why people reoffended. We also get 2 discrete benefits of less gangs and why we're less likely to arrest the wrong person. Why is this important? At the heart, someone being physically and violently abused is so bad. Even if we can save one person, this is so beneficial and we can help the community feel safe. We get less people killing and we get less people murdering, stopping lifelong trauma from the start. We get murderers that don't tear people's families apart, and we get less people riddled with grief and sorrow and this lifelong PTSD. We're trying to prevent poor innocent people from becoming victims. I'll take a pee right now. To be able to walk to school down the street, and you want to be able to send them on a bus alone without having to worry that someone is going to attack them. This is why people really like the police because, you know, they stop crime, and this is why they like giving the police money. We also think this is the reason why police officers are somewhat respected in society because they stop these bad things from happening and they help people feel safe. This is why people don't want to walk in the dark by themselves at night because they feel a sense of vulnerability because they simply don't feel safe. 2, people feel more safe. This feels like there's going to be less crime, and if crime is less likely to happen, we think this is just a really logical step that people are going to feel more safe in general. And 3, why it's important people feel safe. When you feel safe, you can send kids to school, and I've told you before, you're more comfortable sending your kids to school on the bus. We think it's really important a parent understands this and feels that their children are safe. It's sort of it's unlikely that people will be assaulted on the street in the daylight or on the bus, but it's an irrational feeling that they simply can't get rid of, and we want people to have as much safety and that feeling as we can, and we want to minimize this to the max. What do we get here? We have people want to feel more safe, and why it feels more safe, and why that's so important to your everyday average person. We think it's a fine point to run, as the state already infringes on rights for people's safety, and we see this with examples like driver's licenses, where we take away young people's ability to drive and people to drunk drive, because it's going to cause way more harm in the long term to people, innocent people. Why is this so important? We think this is so important because people care about feeling safer. It's like being able to walk down your street at night and not be harassed. It's like not having to run to your car in the dark because you think someone's standing there and is going to stab and murder you. And even if there isn't less crime and they can prove that, it's really important to note that people will feel safer. This principle supersedes every single other idea. What have I proven in this speech? 1, why people reoffend, 2, how we deter violent crime before it happens and reoffending, and 3, that people have a right to feel safe. I just think that's a really, really good thing to do. Don't you?
I thank the speaker for their speech, and now welcome up the excited speaker from Negating team. Please just let us know if you don't wish to be filmed for the live stream.
Yeah, there's nothing before it, so it's fine. Having an ankle bracelet attached to you for the rest of your life is far more significant than the comparative we see on the affirming side of having your driver's license removed for a short period of time. Something that is understated in this debate is that you're going to be monitored and tracked for the rest of your life. So, in this debate I'll be talking about 2 points. The first being how rehabilitation exists and is efficient and why they get worse rehabilitation, and secondly on the violation of personal freedoms. So firstly, on to my first point. So rehabilitation does exist and it is effective and it is present in our current system and status quo. So firstly, the government incentivized to provide rehabilitation programs. It's cheap, the prisons are all in one place in prisons, mass treatment, low additional cost, and you get high benefits from that because rehabilitation has been proven, it works with the right professionals and the right resources. This reduces future government costs, less people will be reoffending, and it looks good for the government if there is less reoffending than what they get voted back in. So therefore they have the incentive to apply it. Why this will be likely to work? The government will make them as good as possible. Like I said, they have the incentive to get re-elected, rehabilitation makes them look good, therefore they'll apply funding to this. Prisoners are going to be receptive to it, they want to live a normal life again, they often regret the crime they commit. There's something that affirming just seems to completely ignore, is that people often, once they've committed a violent crime, usually out of passion or like when they're intoxicated, they often regret it. They don't want that to be the defining feature of their life. They want to go and be successful, they want to have a job, they want to have proper relationships. The crime is often out of character, like I just said, it's intoxicated, it could be vengeful. They are victims of circumstance, not purely evil human beings who need to have a bracelet on for the rest of their lives. Prison isn't nice, people don't want to be there, that's an incentive enough. People are not going to make a value judgment like we pointed out in that POI before they commit a violent crime, whether they think, oh, let's see, 5 years in prison and an ankle bracelet? No, that's just too much. No, they are deterred by the fact of going to prison, going through that horrible process, and then having to live with the fact of what they did afterwards. Having an ankle bracelet on for the rest of their life is just a horrible thing and something that won't be considered in the process of stabbing someone to death. And thirdly, at the end of this, you should believe that a significant number of people convicted of violent crimes will get reintegrated into society. And do not reoffend. So, why affirming get worse rehabilitation? 5 reasons to this. Firstly, people know that they will never be able to reintegrate into society. They will not be receptive to this rehabilitation. They know that they're going to have this bracelet on for the rest of their lives. They'll be easily identifiable, like app characterised, and they now know that there's no chance of them ever living a normal life again. Why would they interact with this rehabilitation material that we value so highly in our society?
On that.
Nope. The social stigma around it. People will treat these people differently. Not differently, badly. They will treat them extremely poorly. Like they said, they will run away from them in the dark. They will see people walking down the street and then feel unsafe all of a sudden. As I've characterised, taking the words out of my mouth really, people assume the worst. They assume that, someone brutally murdered someone, where violent crime covers a lot more of that, and there are varying degrees to it, from assault all the way up to brutal rape.
On that.
This makes finding friends, finding romantic partners, and finding jobs hard, because people are going to immediately identify you as having a violent criminal, and that is going to characterise your entire life from there onwards. Public interaction, just simply going out to the shops, people are going to look at you and know that you once committed a violent crime, maybe when you were 20 or 50 years ago you could have committed a violent crime. That bracelet is still going to be on you for the rest of your life, and that's something that is understated. Second part of this, they feel that the crime is part of their identity. That bracelet is now attached to them forever, and they now associate that bracelet to being a constant reminder that they were once a violent criminal, even if they are no longer one at all.
On that.
Thirdly, the bracelet can give PTSD from crime itself. It's a constant reminder, as crime is traumatic, even for the perpetrator. The abuse often goes both ways. Not only do the victims get affected by it, but they often feel regret, and that regret is heavy. If you do a violent crime, you're not often going to be, it's highly unlikely that you're often going to be proud of it. Whilst in prison, sitting there for a minimum of 5 years, you're going to have lots of time to sit there and think about what you've just done, and I highly doubt that people will sit there and be proud of it. The weight of the regret will be heavy. Fourthly, less motivation against reoffending. As you can't have the bracelet put on twice, the punishment perceived will be less severe. So all their outcomes of people not offending as much are just completely removed, because they've already got the bracelet on. Well, they may as well reoffend. They're probably going to get caught anyway from things like CCTV. And finally, resent towards the government and justice system from this fundamental freedom being robbed even after they serve their time. Not only are they going to be incarcerated, which is horrible and it invokes bad emotions towards government, but now they're going to be constantly tracked for the rest of their lives. Why would they have any love for their state or country? Outcomes of this. People who committed violent crimes are worse integrated to society when released, therefore they could not function as a proper society member, which is the entire point of the incarceration system.
On that.
People are more likely to reoffend. They're more likely to leave prison as emotionally unstable, violent individual with anxiety issues. I'll get onto them later. And even if not, they struggle to hold just a job. They struggle to perform in society. People are going to treat them differently. And they form less meaningful relationships, friends, and romantic relationships, which we think is just something that every human is entitled to. Secondly, I'll take a point.
Yeah, do you think pedophiles should be allowed to be around little girls?
No, of course not. But by strapping them with an ankle bracelet for the rest of their lives, therefore you assume that pedophiles can never unpedophile themselves. So that's really put in poor English, but the point is that by you assuming that once someone's committed a crime, that is a defining feature of their life, which is something the side of the house is against. On to my second point, the violation of personal freedoms. So for some contextually, the vast majority of prisoners deserve privacy on some principle, as the harms of permanently removing it are great. Why is violating privacy so bad? 3 reasons to this. Every movement they make, they know that they are being watched. They feel that their bracelet on that leg. They know that someone is tracking them and someone is watching their every movement to make sure they don't slip up again. That is a horrible feeling. Could you imagine what it is like being watched 24/7, knowing that everything you do is having someone analyse it? Not a pleasant experience. This leads to a general anxiety about life. Everything you do, you have that constant anxiety you're doing something wrong. You have that constant anxiety you're going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, be sent back to prison, which, like I stated before, not a nice place. This is a horrible feeling we want no one to go through. Even if the government doesn't have the resources to watch constantly, the person does not know that. People value their privacy and freedom so highly, it is likely to be perceived that the bracelet, although it's only given their location, is really bad in the person's mind. This bracelet will drive people, we think, over the edge, and they're going to manifest something in their mind that the bracelet is causing extra harm to their life, because they've just come out of prison, they've just had a traumatic violent experience, and now they're under the perception that they're just being watched. This is not a good mental cocktail. Secondly, the government are incentivised to exaggerate the use of these bracelets to make it a more deterrent. So, like I said, this is where they're going to get the idea that they're constantly being watched and monitored from, because the government's going to try and publicise it and say, yay, people are going to stop reoffending. We've just proven to you why that is not true. And thirdly, having a bracelet constantly attached to your body means that removes bodily autonomy, a basic right of being a human. You should have the right to decide what happens to your body, and just because you committed a crime once when you were 20 and intoxicated does not mean that you should have an ankle bracelet attached to you for the rest of your life. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for their speech and welcome up the second speaker of the affirming team.
Good to go. A few things to do in this speech. Firstly, on the idea of the clash of principles between safety and the violation of privacy. Secondly, on the ways we actually reduce crime under our house and why that's so good. And lastly, I'm going to split on how we can make women feel safer in society. Okay, so firstly then on this clash of principles, right? Oliver told you right from the beginning that we as a state have a principled duty to make sure that the people that live in our society feel safe. That's really important. What did they come out with? They came out with the idea of privacy and how it's important for these people to not feel like they're being stalked. And what was the specific line of analysis here? They said that being monitored 24/7 gives them the anxiety that they're constantly being watched, right? I want to flip this. Okay, firstly, we think that that's actually a good thing, right? Because it gives them an extra deterrent from actually committing a crime again. We think that that is really important and part of the reasons why we actually reduce crime. But secondly, we tell you that the government just infringes on people's privacies a lot of the time. For example, take in America after 9/11, right? When the CIA just started hacking into lots of people's computers to try and prevent terrorism. We think that that happens all the time, and this is because it's in the general interest to make sure that society is safe. We think that this principle is extremely important, right? Why is that principle extremely important? I want to put you in the shoes of just the average person, right? You want to feel safe in society. You don't want to feel like you're surrounded by violent criminals. We think that by giving this additional mechanism of bracelets and things, you inherently already feel safer, right? Because that means even though you might not be able to see the bracelet, you know that if there is one around you, they have this bracelet on them, tracking them, so you know that maybe if they do attack you, you have that mechanism to they can be caught, they can be found. We think that that is extremely important. Secondly, we tell you, as I told you before, we as a state have a duty to make sure people feel safe. That's extremely important. And thirdly, we think that feeling safer is necessarily a good thing. We probably would rather have majority of people in society feeling safer if that comes at the cost of some criminals having their privacy infringed upon. That is extremely important, and I think you need to make that the most important thing in this debate, and that people feeling safe is extremely important. Okay then, so what did they tell us here on moving on to the idea of rehabilitation and stuff that they wanted to come out as their main push in their first point? What did they tell us here? They told us that currently the government has rehabilitation programs. A specific line of analysis was that when they're in prison they go to rehabilitation, and then that means they're no longer going to commit violent crimes. Okay. Firstly, I want to note that we also have rehabilitation too. We never said we were going to get rid of that. That means all their mechanisms still stand. We can claim all of that. But what we do have is the additional mechanism of a bracelet that can help deter crimes. But also, secondly, we just reject the premise that rehabilitation actually solves all the problems and stops reoffending altogether. Firstly, why is this? Firstly, we think that these crimes that put them in prison are extreme. We don't think that they're done under the influence of alcohol or something. They're often very planned. They're very calculated as to actually how they're going to execute these crimes. That actually, we think that that is extremely important to understand. We don't think it's just like some drunk incident that puts them in prison, because that's like not fair. Secondly, these people often have like very extreme ideas in their heads, and it's very difficult to actually undo this just simply through rehab and their time in prison.
Yeah,
we think that that also is like really important. But also, what do they want to tell us as their outcomes at this point? They told us that because you don't have a bracelet, you can't live a normal life. That's because people will just treat them poorly because when they see this bracelet. Firstly, I want to note that we don't think it just infringes on them being able to live their normal life. We think that you can still probably just go around and act in society. But also, secondly, the idea that people are gonna look at them horribly and just because they see the bracelet is just not true, right? When you probably see someone with an ankle monitor on, your first thought probably isn't gonna be I'm going to harass them, I'm gonna call them a horrible criminal, I'm gonna look at them poorly. You're probably just gonna be oh, okay, and then you're gonna move on because you probably don't want to interact with them in that way. But also, we think that criminals criminal reoffense just still occurs under their side, right? That's a massive problem that's happening right now. Because criminal reoffensing, that's why we need these bracelets in the first place. The problem, it still exists. Unclear how they actually fix that if they're just using the current government system of rehabilitation. So I think, what did Oliver tell you under this point? We actually reduced crime, right? Because the bracelets act as a deterrent. He gave you all of these mechanisms. Here is some basic material, right, for this. Note that the scale of this impact is extremely massive, and that, we impact all of society, and that, we think that if we can reduce, if we can get violent offenders, even 5 of them to just stop reoffending, we think that that is really good because we just make society safer. That is extremely important, noting back to the principle that we as a state have a duty to make people feel safe. That's extremely important. But also, by reducing crime, that's just a good thing, right? We don't want a violent society full of crime. Okay, I want you to weigh this extremely highly, right? Because that's extremely important. Okay, I'll take a POI now.
Won't people feel more endangered seeing a violent offender than just someone on the street trying to live a normal life?
I think they will feel slightly safer in that they know that this violent person probably does have a mechanism where they can be caught instead of just them attacking you and then you have no idea how to prove that they did attack you. Okay, onto my split on how we can make women feel safer. Context, what do we have to understand at the beginning of this point? Misogyny and sexual assault is literally one of the most pernicious violent crimes and the highest rates in society, right? And often, women are just very scared to take it to court because it's a very horrible experience to talk about and they're often not listened to. Why is this true? Firstly, misogyny often manifests itself as a very violent and external experience. Men feel like they hold power and supremacy over women inherently and that they can have the ability to physically express this belief onto women, such as sexual assault or sexual abuse. Secondly, because of this, women are literally always had this subconscious fear of men when they're walking down the street. For example, you might be walking down the street and a tradie hollers at you and says, "Nice top." A woman isn't going to think "Oh my god, that man's thinking I have a nice top." She's thinking, she's very, very scared because if that man is willing to call out in public and address me as a person, what else are they willing to do? I begin to start having this fear. I begin to start walking faster because I'm scared that this guy is going to follow me and do something horrible to me. We think that is extremely important. Thirdly, we think when women take these sexual assault and abuse cases to court, it's extremely hard to prove, right? Because firstly, it's a he said, she said situation. That's extremely hard to prove. But also, secondly, it's extremely difficult experiences to talk about in court because it's something super personal to you. Fourthly, now that repeated offenders repeated offenders do have these bracelets of these violent crimes, we think women feel safer. Why is this? A, because women could notice these bracelets and feel the need that I should stay away from them. But also secondly, they have this added sense of security and that if something does happen to them, they can prove it with that bracelet that they have on their hand. Fifthly, that means when you actually do take it to court, we think that you can prove that this man was horrible outcomes. What do we prove at the end of this point? Firstly, we tell you that misogyny is an extremely horrible problem. Most violent crimes stems from this. Secondly, women are currently extremely scared. Thirdly, the bracelets allow women to feel safer. Okay, why is this so important? Note that I think this point is super important because women are literally more vulnerable in society. They're the most vulnerable here. They're susceptible to horrible violent crimes because women have this fear of misogyny in their minds, right? Okay, because we can reduce this issue for women, we can allow women to feel safer. Note that that is extremely important because we don't want women walking down the street fearing for their lives that they're going to be assaulted by the tradie that hollers at them. We think that that is extremely important, and also note that this ties back to our principle. We can follow through because we allow this super marginalized group to feel safer.
We thank the speaker for their speech and welcome up the second speaker of the Negating team.
The most vulnerable group in this debate is the people who don't have a chance to reintegrate into society as a result of one mistake that they made in their past. It's the people who, having already served their punishment of 5 years in prison, now have to be determined with an ankle monitor in every single micro-interaction that they ever make in their life. They never have a chance to move past this mistake. That is when you get reoffending, because people are just labelled as criminals and can never escape from this. A couple of things to touch on in the speech. Firstly, on the impacts to the criminal themselves. Secondly, on deterrence and rehabilitation, and finally on the impacts to society. Firstly then on the impacts to the criminal, why is this the most important thing in this debate? 3 reasons. Firstly, on vulnerability. Note that the people who are committing these violent crimes probably come from marginalised societies and backgrounds, because that is probably just what forced them into crime in the first place. If you were born and grown up around gangs and things like that, that's probably what's going to lead to normalization of crime, and you therefore committing these crimes when you're older in an irrational fit of rage or something like that. But secondly, on depth. These people now have every single interaction for the rest of their life influenced by the reminder of their biggest regret, of the mistake that they wish they never made. These people never actually get a chance to reintegrate. These people's lives are determined by one single mistake. That is a hugely deep harm. But thirdly, on permanence. You can't get rid of this bracelet. It affects people's lives for their entire lives. That's something that you can't go back on. What did we tell you about the impacts on criminals, to criminals outrightly? We told you that you get resentment to the government and against the justice system because you're now having your rights infringed upon, and you feel that you have no autonomy that was never sufficiently responded from AF. And we also tell you that people just feel unnerved and they feel like that they're overthinking, that they're being watched. Okay. What does this mean? It means that when you're walking down the street and with their ankle monitor on, and people are ducking their heads to avoid you, they're crossing the street so they don't have to walk past you. They're are adverse to talking to you or making friends with you. Your entire life is now one that is determined by your past. That is not something that we're willing to stand for. Because even if you buy, for whatever reason, that people are going to be so likely to reoffend, the ones who don't never get a chance to reintegrate back into society, for all the reasons that I gave you at the beginning of the speech, that is what we should care the most about in this debate. AF needed to respond to that. Next then on deterrence, which I think is a big part of AF's case. What do they tell us on deterrence? They tell us that people are only going to be committing crimes when they think that they're going to be getting away with it, and they're going to be making really informed cost-benefit analyses. Look, crime committers just aren't acting rationally, particularly not if they're committing a violent crimes. I think most violent crimes look like smashing a beer bottle over someone's head in a drunken fit of rage. They told us that actually it's going to be planned mass serial murders. But look, people committing these really, really serious massive crimes are probably just not in the scope of this debate, because this debate is about people who are being released back into society. These people are probably just in prison for life and just aren't going to be coming back into society. I don't think we're having serial killers in the scope of this debate. That washes out a big part of the material here. Look, almost no crimes are worth 5 to 30 years of prison time. Crimes right? Because that's just like a big chunk of your life that you're losing. If people were making cost-benefit analyses, crimes just wouldn't be happening. But obviously they still are because people aren't acting rationally. It looks like being under the influence of drugs or alcohol. It looks like, say, having anger issues and being really mad. It looks like being influenced by like gangs or your friends or things like that. These decisions are not being made rationally. People are not making cost-benefit analyses before they commit crimes.
On that,
The next thing we say is that we just gave you heaps of material at Riley regarding social stigma and like this forced internalization by waking up every day and seeing this ankle on your wrist. These people now have every single moment for the rest of their lives determined on the basis they're now labelled as a criminal in society. That is an impossible cycle to break out of because it's so permanent. That is the point at which you resort to reoffending out of desperation, feeling that you have no way to get a job or to make any friends. That is when you get reoffends. That is the harm on their side because you feel like you have no way out. But secondly, if this person is truly going to reoffend after prison, right, a bracelet is just not going to affect the decision-making process to such a degree for an irrational actor who is about to commit assault. I've already covered that. But finally then, in terms of like affecting your decision-making in terms of reoffends, weigh the 10 years that you spent in prison, surrounded by other criminals and rehab programs, with no choice but to reflect on your mistake against a single bracelet on your leg. As the best case here is a marginal benefit of that bracelet, they never prove why that is going to be considerably beneficial over the symmetric benefit, which is the 10 years prison time. That is where you get the actual change to people's decision-making. What did we tell you then at Riley on why they get worse rehabilitation? We told you 5 reasons. Firstly, people know that they can never truly integrate back into society, so we're just less likely to engage in rehab in prison. Secondly, you get this internalization of the label of criminality. Thirdly, you get PTSD. You're constantly reminded of like the worst moment of your life. Fourthly, you have less motivation against reoffending. And fifthly, you have resentment against the system because your freedom is robbed as a result of this mistake. At the end of this point then, I think you should believe that probably like reoffense is better on our side, but even if it isn't, it's probably just a marginal benefit on the side because like what's symmetric in this debate is the fact that these people are still spending 10 years in prison. That is where the change actually happens.
Yeah.
Finally then on the impacts to society and the right to feel safe, before I move on, I'll take a point.
When men have literally assaulted and like abused women and like literally damaged their reproductive systems, how do you ensure these women feel safe when they're released back into
Okay,
society?
I'm just about to get onto that point, so thanks, I guess. Okay, look, I think that most of the material here on like people feeling safe is just contingent on the fact that people will see the bracelet and be like, oh yeah, that's going to deter crime. I think their entire point is contingent on this. What our response is here. Look, people just won't be thinking that this bracelet is strong enough to be deterring crime because they just associate this monitor with the crime that was committed in the past. When you see someone with a monitor in public, your innately pessimistic nature will probably just take over, meaning that you associate this crime you associate this monitor with the crime of the person's past, rather than like the really optimistic, hopeful future of deterrence. People, when it comes to criminals, are just like innately scared and like anxious, and they're not going to be as optimistic as that would have you believe. Why is this? People just don't trust the government that much to like blindly think that a monitor that they put on them is going to stop reoffense. Like if all the monitor is doing is telling you with the location, the location of this person, that's just like not enough for people to actually trust the government to like trust the government and the justice system to actually prevent any crime. People feel safe when they know that the criminals are being rehabilitated in prison. When they're out of sight, out of mind, that's symmetric because we still have prison on both sides. Look, I think at the end of dealing with the material here, the scope on our impacts here is just limited, and that people probably just know that criminals are out there in either case. But the difference is they aren't constantly being reminded that these criminals are out there because you're not constantly seeing people with these ankle bracelets on. What that means then is that on our side, you have people going outside and not constantly being reminded that there's criminals amongst them because, look, at the end of the day, criminals exist in either world. We'd rather people just not constantly be worrying about that. All right, finally then on my split point on the harms to society. 2 reasons here. Firstly, on public perception. When people see others walking around with bracelets on their ankle, you probably just form associations with really negative crimes because like you think that the government is going to such measures to punish these people. But secondly, on stigma. People are just biased against criminals because of our inherently pessimistic and anxious nature. When you now have people with a clearly visible label of these people in public as criminals, you get this internalized fear that like violent crimes are constantly walking amongst you. The impact here is that people just feel anxious about going outside into a world where they see heaps of criminals around them. We would rather these people don't have to constantly have this in the back of their mind. They can go to the supermarket without this fear. Proud to oppose.
We thank the speaker for their speech and welcome up the third speaker of the affirming team.
Don't scratch it out.
The Neg has lost today's debate when they determine the most important stakeholder as like the criminals who are like having these ankle bracelets put on, rather than like women feeling safe in the street when they walk around, or like people being able to put their kids on the bus, or like people not having their families torn apart by like really damaging assaults and murders. They lose today's debate when they care only about the criminals. 2 points of clash for the House today. Firstly, who better like reduces crime, and secondly, who is principally just. Moving on to my first point of clash, who better rebukes crime. Now, they gave this like really weird push about rehabilitation and tried to make it seem like it's exclusive to them, but it's not. I'll explain why. So they told us about rehabilitation. We think we get it better as well, but we think we get it as well, but we also think we get it better because we can like work with the counsellors and the rehabilitation programs after they get out of prison with these ankle monitors and be like making sure they're not going to like dangerous plots, like seeing if they like are getting involved in like drugs, gangs. Like we gave you mechanisms at first. We think we do a really good job of being able to work with them to stop like them getting it like slipping back into a criminal life, and we can use these monitors to like help support them, help them not get like falsely convicted, which means we get rehabilitation better. Now, why are people like, they give us kind of weird mechanisms being like, they won't think they're going to integrate, so they're just never going to try and integrate, which means they're going to like keep reoffending, they're just not even going to try in the rehabilitation. We don't think this really makes sense, because firstly, from first, we told you like what these bracelets actually look like. We think they look like Apple Watches like on your wrist. Like we don't think they're like some like big chunky ankle monitor that's like really obvious. We think it's just like really impractical to do this in the first place, and we think like the technology's there. We've told you that through. Like even if you don't buy that, they gave you like all these reasons about how like they're not going to be able to live a normal life because people are going to see it. We think people see it anyway. We think people like when you have like it's on your record, like when you go to jobs, people know. We think it's really harmful that if you try and hide it from a significant other. We think like you shouldn't hide like if you've assaulted someone when you're younger. We don't think that's something you can just like hide from someone you're getting in a relationship with. And we don't think it's going to be like super obvious to someone who's working in a supermarket. So we think only people close to you are going to know about this crime, and we think it's important that they know about this crime, and we think people are able to see and like trust that people like can get better. Like that's why criminals can still have like relationships in the status quo. We think like people with that understanding they're going to be better. We think a lot of their material is really bad. Then they told us like people are going to like run away when they see them on the street like at night. We think that's actually kind of a good thing. Like if we've got someone who's like assaulted someone and have like tendencies to be like aggressive, we think like if you're seeing them by yourself in the night, we think it's actually a good thing that you can like see, oh, they could like assault me, like they're dangerous people. Now this gets onto like their characterizations. If it's like only like a drunk incident, like people do crimes. We think like, yes, this happens some of the time, and like some of the time, firstly, we think like drunk people still don't do like really physically assaulting things. We think like people who are people who are drunk and do these types of things actually have like aggressive tendencies anyway, and we don't think we should be like, oh, but they made a mistake when they were drunk, so we shouldn't be able to put this ankle bracelet on. We think it's really harmful, a lot of these assaults, because we think, like, literally in the characterizations by Neg, that they often happen in like domestic abuse cases, which we think is so harmful, and we think like people who domestically abuse their wives should probably like have something on them, and we think this is like probably something people should know about, that they're like really aggressive and assaulting like that. Secondly, you're gonna like regret it for your whole life. Like they gave us this weird material on like regretting it for your whole life. We think people are always gonna remember if they commit a really violent crime and spend 5 years in prison. We think you're not gonna like leave in 5 years and just like, oh wait, I forgot I was in prison. Like we think maybe it's a reminder. We also think that's gonna be a really good thing, because we think it's gonna remind people and like for generations to come, make sure like their kids don't get caught in those crimes. We think like they're gonna like remember like the importance of like losing the crimes. So what have I proved to you? Well, I've proved to you that rehab like isn't exclusive for them. I've proved to you that we get it better, and I've proved to you that like they actually can live like relatively normal lives. Maybe their lives will be different, but we think that's also a good thing, because these people are criminals who have committed really violent crimes. We think there's like a very small case where it's like, oh, it's bad for them, but we think that like it doesn't weigh against what we've got. Now, they've really strawmanned our case about deterrence. They're saying like they get better deterrence because their rehabilitation proved that doesn't work. And then they told us that like they only talked about like the one mech about like planning the crime. We gave you lots of other mechs about how like you've got like we gave you lots of other mechs like you can't be like influenced in gangs, like you're just gonna be able to defer away from a criminal life with this ankle bracelet. Lots of mechs from first. They only strawmanned our case focusing on it's not gonna be a split decision when you're drunk. Firstly, we've told you that like a lot of crimes are like made with like intent, and like people do think about their crimes, and people will think about like these bracelets, and like we think we do have an effective way to deter people from further committing crimes, because we think we can like make sure that they like don't go back to the place they reoffended, they don't like try and go get revenge. Like we think we've proved to you that they do have a deterrence, and we think they're strawmanning our case, only talking about that one mechanism we provided you. Now, what are the outcomes? Well, I think we've proved that a lot of the outcomes they get are like really exclusive, and even if you do believe their outcomes about like the criminals living worse lives, we think that just doesn't matter as much as like the really other important factors, and we think they miss what matters in this debate. Firstly, Nathan split about like women being like highly targeted and like really struggling in a lot of these violent crimes. Why is this so important? Well, firstly, it provides them with an added layer of safety, and secondly, if these crimes do exist, they have a much better chance of being able to like prove the crimes, and like that layer of support to say like, I can go out because I know this guy had a monitor on, I know that I can prove he was there, I'm not going to feel scared to go up against it because I don't want to do like a he said, she said situation. We think this is debate-winning material, and we think it's so important, and we don't understand why the Neg has ignored this material so much in this debate. Secondly, we also just think any reduction in like serious like assault, like murders, like discontinuation of reoffending can be so harmful to like not just the people it happens to, but often the families, like if you get like caught in those situations. Now moving on to like the principal point. Now they gave us like this principle on like privacy and being watched. Firstly, we violate this freedom with CCTV. Secondly, like like when you go to prison, like you're a criminal, like you already like have a lot of those things anyway. And thirdly, they gave us like it's gonna be like cause lots of anxiety and things. Like, it's not really realistic with just GPS tracking. Like, you don't start getting, like, heaps of anxiety when, like, mum puts you on Find My. Like, you can kind of just, like, okay, mum might watch me occasionally. You're not having, like, one person watch them exactly the same. Like, a lot of their material saying driving them over the mental edge isn't super realistic. Now, what's the split that we gave you? They told us, like, they ignored, like, the main point of our split, our principle, saying, they're just not going to trust the government, and they're not going to think like the government can like do this and keep them safe. We think like we told you that it's just like maybe it's not like the most like logical thing, but we think people are just going to feel that like level of safety, and like they're going to feel safer in the debate. Why is this so important? Well, we think we want to have people feeling safer when they walk down the street. We want to have people feeling safer when they send their kids to like school, even though their kids probably aren't going to get harmed, and it probably don't. Just that level of safety with criminals wearing ankle bracelets make them feel much safer in the status quo. So important, so proud to propose.
We thank the speaker for their speech and welcome up the third speaker of the Negating team.
You cannot say that a man never adjusting into being a better person after one crime that he regrets for his entire life that he committed when he was drunk, when he was angry, when he was doing something that he didn't really want to do in hindsight, when he is on his deathbed at 90 years old with an ankle monitor on his ankle, reminded of the one thing that he regrets most, we think that this is an extremely significant harm that cannot be outweighed by the benefits of deterrence that we don't think they even get, right? I'm going to talk about a few things in this debate. Firstly, I'll talk about stigma and why it exists and why it's bad. Secondly, I'll talk about rehab, why there are benefits to rehab that are exclusive and outside. Thirdly, I'll talk about the violation of freedoms and the harms that brings. And then fourthly, I'll talk about deterrence, and then contingent on this is then the public perception of safety. But before all of that, I just want to touch on misogyny, because I've talked about it a lot, but I don't think it's really important, because it's quite clearly just a subset of their other points that they've tried to make important to seem like they're the feminist side. Obviously, we support women, we support ending misogyny and rape and all that stuff as well, and we just do it better, and I'm about to prove that, right? But before that, I just want to touch on the more important impact on this debate, which is about the criminals. Firstly, on the stigma, which I said just doesn't exist, by contradicting themselves, by saying that these ankle monitors are invisible, like they're Apple Watches that like no one ever sees, but also that they make people feel safer because they can tell like when criminals are criminals. We tell you that we know what ankle monitors are, right? Obviously they're going to be visible. We also tell you that when they're producing so many more of them, because there are so many more criminals getting them, they're going to need to be cheapened, they're likely to be bulky, the government doesn't have a reasonable incentive to make them super high-tech and slim. So they're going to be visible, right? And we also tell you that any benefit that they get of people avoiding criminals and feeling safer requires them to be visible. And we tell you that this is actually a separate harm from a criminal record, right? Because a criminal record is different for a few reasons, right? It has nuance. It actually tells you what crime was committed, when it was committed, the circumstances in which it was committed. And ankle monitor does none of that. It just tells, hey guys, look at this guy, he's a criminal, right? And we also tell you that people are irrational. They're going to assume the worst. They're going to be afraid, so they're going to think that everyone who has an ankle monitor, or at least assume, or at least have in the back of mind that they might be a murderer. Yeah, go.
In terms of freedom, do you think a bracelet is better or worse than 24-hour surveillance and strip searches in prison?
We think that there's something to be said here about proportionality, right? We think that, yes, like, we think that while these people are in prison, we think that this surveillance is obviously less of a bad harm than having surveillance for their entire life. And we also think that this surveillance serves other purposes, like preventing reoffense while they're in their most vulnerable immediately after the crime. Anyway, we've proven without much rebuttal why the stigma exists and why it's so bad. We tell that people are going to not be able to form as many meaningful relationships, or they're more likely to form these relationships with other criminals who won't judge them as harshly. They're going to struggle to have jobs, perform well in these jobs. Every interaction in their life is going to be worse because people think they're a criminal. We think that this is going to have a massive impact on their entire life. because, you know, like literally for the 70 years maybe after they commit this crime, they're going to have this stigma against them. So it absolutely cannot fall out of the debate, and it's extremely important. But this stigma also leads into our points about rehab and why rehab and good rehab is exclusive to our side. We say that when people know that once they leave prison, they're going to be facing this stigma, they're less inclined to try to rehabilitate themselves, work to improve themselves as a person, because it's just a limit to how much they can reintegrate into society. But there are also other exclusive reasons for why we get worse rehabilitation once they're out of prison. We told you about how crimes can be traumatic even for the people who committed them. So when you have constant PTSD every time you feel this ankle on your leg, right, it's going to make you a less functioning member of society. We also tell you that just having the internalized idea that you are a criminal, that you were a criminal because you had this bracelet on you, is going to make you less likely to rehabilitate and live a normal life, be able to form meaningful connections with other people who maybe weren't criminals. So at the end of this, we say that when we have these ankle bracelets, criminals are less likely to be able to lead more normal lives that they often deserve after these crimes. Because although we believe in punishment, not just for punishment's sake, but also to keep potentially dangerous people out of society and also to rehabilitate them and also to give victims some kind of closure, we don't believe in it in the extent that causes all of these harms, right? So we just don't think it's worth it. We also tell you that most criminals, 80 years after their crime, you can't really predict whether they're still going to be a bad person because we just don't think it's internal. We think that personal values and habits can change over time. So we think that the impacts of good rehabilitation, similar to the ideas of stigma, is that like people are just able to form more meaningful connections. They're able to live their life better. Rather than having, you know, like constant like mental breakdowns, maybe they're more likely to fall into drug and alcohol abuse when they aren't well rehabilitated. We also tell you that this leads into more reoffense, and I'll expand on reoffense and offense later. But basically, when you aren't well rehabilitated, you're more likely to commit crimes. I think that's pretty intuitive, and it's obviously something not that we stand for on this side of the house. Finally, just to weigh this, we want to say that why is this so important, rehabilitation? We say that how someone is rehabilitated literally affects their entire life because it changes the person that you are. So we think it's extremely important, both for the criminal themselves and how they lead their lives and having good outcomes later on, but also for other people, because every interaction that someone has with a criminal will be more positive if they are well rehabilitated. We think that the scale for this is massive, and also the scope for this is massive, because we can see how rehabilitation can completely change a person if they've committed these crimes because of reasons that can be fixed. You know, like maybe they have drug, alcohol problems, maybe they had a poor upbringing, maybe they've been raised around bad influences. The main rebuttal that they've had for this rehabilitation, sorry, I'm sort of backtracking, is they just said that criminals have extreme ideas and they can't be rehabbed. I've already given reasons, and we've given reasons down the line, why there are factors that cause crimes that can be adjusted and can be changed. We say that most people are not evil, and therefore most criminals are not inherently and unfixably evil. So, anyway, what is their main push then that justifies these massive harms that are caused to these criminals by not allowing them to rehabilitate properly and forcing the stigma upon them, right? Their main one is that it deters crime. And we just don't think this is realistic because we told you down the line that criminals do not perform a cost-benefit analysis before they decide to beat their wife. Why is this? We think it's pretty obvious, right? For lots of reasons. First of all, 5 years in prison, 10 years, 30 years in prison is already really bad, and there's almost no benefit that someone could gain that would outweigh this. So it's pretty clear intuitively that these people are not acting rationally. Additionally, we tell you that even if they are acting rationally and weighing it up, we just don't think that this extra bracelet is going to make that much of a difference, because people are notoriously bad at perceiving the long-term impact and harms. They're more focused on the short term. So actually 5 years in prison is more perceivable to them than the potential long-term harms. We see people get tattoos that they regret later, or we see people aren't always thinking about the far, far future. And so for these new criminals, we just don't think there's going to be much of a change in deterrence, especially when you consider all the other impacts which can affect rationality and still put people in prison that haven't rebutted these. Things like alcohol, you still go to jail if you kill someone while you were drunk. No, I already took one. And also things just having ideals pushed upon you by having a poor upbringing, all those things can be changed. So then the other example of deterrence that they gave is returning criminals and how they don't want to be caught, and so when they have the bracelet, they won't do it. We tell you that there isn't much of a change about not wanting to be caught, because we tell you that in general criminals are caught anyway, so they still have this deterrence. But we also tell you that again, they're not acting rationally. And finally, we tell you that there's actually less of a deterrence here because they've already had the most important part of the punishment, the ankle bracelet put upon them, and you can't put an ankle bracelet on twice. And then I don't have much time left, but just on the public safety perception, obviously a lot of this is contingent on there actually being less crime and people understanding that there is less crime for them to feel safer. When there isn't actually less crime, we don't think that there is a perception of public safety. We also just tell you that it's not that important because most people already have this perception of public safety from the police, right, who already exist. So people already already feel safe. And ankle monitors of being effective already relies on police being effective. We also tell you that people's fear is often irrational and not affected by these things anyway. So at the end, when they don't get deterrence and they don't get people feeling safer, they cannot possibly outweigh the massive harms to criminals and the people around them.
We thank the speaker for their speech, and in traditional debating style, we'll reverse the orders for reply and welcome up the reply speaker of the NEG team. For replies, I'll just have a warning at 3 minutes, and then have it full.
F wants you to believe that people are just inherently evil and are incapable of change. They want you to think that the only crimes that occur are the most planned, like huge mob operations. They ignore the young marginalised kid who was peer pressured into a crime when they were 18, who they uniquely ruin the lives of. That is who matters in this debate. Two things to look at, firstly on the impact to the criminal, and secondly on the impacts to society. Right. Why is the impact to criminals the most important thing in this debate? 4 reasons. Firstly, on vulnerability. People are probably coming from marginalised backgrounds. We already explained this at second and third. Secondly, on depth, there's just a huge impact that they can never avoid. And thirdly, on permanence, they're never getting away from this. But fourthly, as we pointed out at Connor, on contingency. F's entire material about societal safety is contingent, not only on A, deterrence actually happening, but also B, on the entirety of society to trust that these ankle bracelets will be causing deterrence, even in their best case, if they are getting some degree of less crime. That link was never made, and we proved why it uniquely wouldn't occur, and they get the opposite of the impact that they claim. All right. Our key reason on deterrence is that people are more likely to reoffend when their entire identity is boiled down to being a criminal because they feel like they have no way out. When you're walking down the street and people are avoiding you, they're ducking their heads, they're crossing the streets. When people are reluctant to introduce themselves to you and shake your hand, that is the point at which you feel ostracized and isolated from society. You don't feel like a normal person because all you are is an ex-criminal. That is the harm that we presented on our side. We tell you that these people who feel like they have no chance in society are the ones who are most likely to resort to reoffending crime because they are so desperate. Look, I think AF's only material here really is that criminals who, before they commit a crime, will be undergoing cost-benefit analyses upon their decision-making. We explained many ways in which crimes are going to be committed irrationally. They look like, 1, being under the influence of drugs and alcohol, which obviously just change your brain chemistry, you're acting different to who you normally are. Secondly, peer pressure. This is particularly important for people who are brought up in marginalised societies where you're surrounded by gangs and other people who are committing crimes. These people are more likely to be told if you don't commit this crime, you're not going to be initiated as the gang. Initiated into the gang, these people acting rationally. But thirdly, out of socioeconomic desperation. If you have no money and can't eat unless you undergo aggravated assault or something in order to just get some money for food, these are the people who aren't acting rationally. They're not going to be considering all the harms, right? If people were acting so rationally, no one would commit crimes because no one wants to go to jail for 5, 10, 20 years. And I think that alone is just proof enough that these people aren't going to be making these decisions. Therefore, having an ankle bracelet on your body is just not going to affect these decisions to the extent that they want you to believe. All right. Next thing on society. AF's material here is about people seeing the ankle monitors and believing in deterrence and believing that these people won't commit crimes again. Note that it includes their material in the split about women feeling safer. The first thing to note here is that this, just their own material here, just washes the other material about the monitors being small and invisible, because their path to victory on society is just reliant on other people seeing the monitors. So I think it's unclear why you just have a small little Apple Watch. But secondly, more importantly, all we really need them to prove to you under this point is that even if deterrence does occur in our best case, others in society just won't be believing in that sufficiently and therefore will actually feel more scared and anxious onto our side. We told you that people's pessimistic nature just inherently means that they're scared or at least biased against criminals. That's something that we see in the status quo, where it's harder for criminals already to get a job because they have a criminal record and things like that. We tell you that when you're walking around in the streets and you see people with ankle monitors, you're constantly reminded that these criminals are out there. That is the point at which you get more fear. That is the point at which you get people not wanting to send their kids on the bus. On the outside, you don't have these people having constant reminders that criminals are out there, because note that ex-criminals exist in either world. That is symmetric. When people aren't constantly thinking about this in the back of their mind, that is when they feel safer to go into society proud to oppose.
We thank the speaker for their speech and welcome up the reply speaker of the affirming team to close the debate.
Am I all good to go? When criminals exist on either side of the house, we think it's better on our side of the house that we have that added sense of security of the victims feeling safer, but additionally the deterrence of no longer committing more crimes. A few things to go over in the speech. Firstly, the criminals after they leave prison. Secondly, how does it impact society, particularly on victims? And lastly, I'm gonna just whip that principle on how we can win on that principle alone. Okay, so firstly then on criminals. Note that this was their big push. If I can mitigate this material enough, I think that drops out of the debate. So what did they tell us? They gave us this characterization that criminals are just people that made bad judgments and they regret. We tell you that this is just not true. We think those that commit horrible crimes, as we gave you in responses, they make they calculate it themselves. They're extremely extreme people. They're very, very bad. We don't understand why exactly they're going to regret the crime once they leave. But also they told us that rehab is just going to fix that problem. Note that we gave you several responses here as to why rehab isn't actually working and that the problem still exists. But additionally, that the idea that rehab is perfect just does not fit, because I can explain exactly how that happens. So then, what do they tell us about criminals when they go back into society? They told us that criminals are going to be marginalized and they're going to be treated really poorly and they're going to be constantly monitored. I think that that's firstly, I think that's just really extreme, but also secondly, we think that that's fine and we're willing to make that trade-off. That means that one, people feel safer, but also additionally on Leo's material about how these criminals can probably teach their kids, hey look, you shouldn't do this, otherwise you'll be treated like me. We think that that is really important in fixing the future problems. But also note that Oliver also gave you material in his first speech is how we don't get false convictions and that these monitors can back these criminals up and all of that things. I want to note that this material isn't particularly important in this debate, and what's important is probably the impact on society. So what did we tell you here? We told you that society is going to be safer. This was because criminals are going to be deterred from reoffending because of this bracelet. This is because they're being constantly monitored. That means that they can't do whatever they want. They have that added protection. They can't go out and start abusing people, otherwise they will be caught. We think that is really important, and know that they never directly responded to this. But also, what did we tell you here? That means we get a reduction of crime. That's extremely important, and that we don't want people committing violent crimes in the street, right? We think that that's important. So then, also, I think what's very important here is my split on women and things. At third, they told us that it's not relevant in this debate. I think that it is actually really, really important in this debate, and that we don't want people being women being abused and sexually assaulted. I think that that is uniquely harmful, a benefit we can claim under our side of the house as to how we actually reduce that. I think that's important. But also, we just think that that is important for society being safer. But then, lastly, let's talk about this principle that they never really engaged with. We told you from the beginning that we as a state have a principled duty to make sure people feel safe in society. This is important because put yourself in the shoes of the average person. They don't want, they probably don't have a nuanced understanding of criminals and why they commit things. They're probably just going to understand criminals bad. They want to feel safe. And if they have the idea that bracelets exist, they just have this automatic sense of I feel slightly safer. We think that is extremely important because that means they can walk out on they feel more confident walking out on the street at night by themselves. They feel confident to send their kids on the bus. That's extremely important, and I think if we can prove to you that people feel safer, we think that because we fulfill this principle, we can win this debate. That's extremely that's extremely important because by making people feel safer in society, you don't have as much fear. And as we told you, we actually do get the practical outcomes of society being safer. Note that they never really contended with that there. Ultimately, I think what you have to deal with at the end of this speech when weighing all this up is that we actually reduce crime. We think that society being safer is more important than like criminals having a slightly tougher life when they leave prison. If that means people aren't going to be assaulted, if women aren't going to be like sexually abused, we think that that's more important than that.
Thanks everybody for a wonderful debate. Like you cross the floor, shake hands, and then if I can ask everyone to exit the room, apologies, that's how I'll consider the result. Thank you very much. Thanks.